Greetings. This webinar and the 7 others in the Developing Town Center Microgrid series discuss results from a research project undertaken by the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities with financial support from the United States Department of Energy. All of the webinars, the original report, and fact sheets can be found on the NJIT microgrids.io website. I am Mark Pfeiffer, your host of these webinars and the principal researcher and author on the study on which they are based. The purpose of the project was to discuss the process of procuring and financing the breed of microgrids called town center microgrids. For the purposes of the study, they were defined as microgrids developed in downtown areas of communities that deliver power to a physically non-contiguous group of critical facilities, often involving multiple distributed energy resources and crossing multiple public rights of way. Now, in other words, these are microgrids with distributed energy resources that support critical facilities when EDC power isn't available and can regularly run in islanded mode from an EDC supply and distribution. Town center microgrids are distinct from 2 other common types of microgrids. Number 1, single-site microgrids that serve a single building like a hospital, school, or public housing building. And 2, campus microgrids that are deployed at institutional campuses in government, education, and business sectors that power multiple structures through on-site generation. In both cases, the owner has control over the resources. There are many examples of successful single-site and campus, critical and non-critical facility microgrids. TC microgrids, on the other hand, are far more complicated and, at least to date, far less common. In fact, based on the results of our study, the idea of a truly successful town center microgrid as an off-grid power supply for critical facilities remains an aspirational one. Outside of specialized use cases, the traditional role of electricity distribution companies and the existing regulatory and economic system under which they operate constitute significant challenges to the development of TC microgrids. The first of these challenges include EDC franchise rights. Most states have a statutory or regulatory regime that may limit the ability of an entity other than an existing EDC from distributing energy to customers or accessing the right of way to do so. This has turned out to be a significant hurdle and obstacle for those municipalities that have considered developing town center microgrids. The next challenges are financial. In cases where there is a legal workaround to the franchise rights issue that allows the microgrid to serve at least a subset of the desired town center customers, then operating the microgrid may be too costly. There are 2 issues that are part of this. The first is cost recovery. Unlike an EDC that may be able to allocate costs through rates over a large segment of its customer base, the cost of a non-EDC-owned microgrid must be recovered from a customer pool, which may be much smaller than the actual number of persons benefited. This could clearly be the case with a town center microgrid. The second issue is cross-subsidization. If the project can work with the EDC to underground otherwise above-ground lines, it adds ratepayer value through the added resilience it brings to the community. On the other hand, it could also cross-subsidize different customer classes, something that state regulators frown upon. However, if the EDC can factor in an appropriate value into its rate base for cost recovery of the improvement, there may be a fruitful intersection of interest for all parties. The challenge here is how to put a value on resilience for public purposes without unduly shifting costs. We'll be talking about that issue in part 7 of this series. Continuing with our challenges, let's talk about the regulatory one. It has 2 aspects. The first being regulatory burden. Depending on a state's regulatory environment, a microgrid that serves more than one customer could result in the regulation of the microgrid owner as its own EDC. If this is the case, the cost burden of regulatory compliance, unless waived or modified, may make the project economically unfeasible. The other aspect is regulatory compliance. Each state has its own regulatory environment that affects DER ownership, controls, system revenue, cost implications, and technical matters. These issues complicate the financial challenge of TC microgrid design and financing. It also affects cost recovery and customer service requirements. These can sometimes be some of the hardest hurdles to overcome. Our next challenge is technical compliance. Both EDCs and microgrid designers advocate that electrical system safety is paramount. While that is a general consensus, this can break down over implementation details. Agreement on standards, controls, redundancy, and power supply reliability elements, particularly at the point of common coupling, which is where DER enters the distribution system, it is hard to come by. In addition, because of the ongoing evolution of DER, industry standards such as those promulgated by the IEEE, they are evolving as I speak, and reasonable parties may have different approaches to addressing them. And finally, we have societal and public policy issues. While TC microgrids may add resilience and reliability in emergency situations for our critical facilities, not all configurations will be consistent with balancing short and long-term statewide policies of ensuring the fiscal sustainability of the grid, greenhouse gas reduction, and the funding of energy efficiency programs. This has become a very complicated area, and there's a lot to talk about with it. So while these challenges are significant, they're not necessarily insurmountable. The remainder of our webinar series and the fact sheets that accompany each webinar unpack these issues in more detail by addressing the following town center microgrid development challenge categories. Our second webinar will cover procurement challenges. Number 3, financing challenges. Number 4 will dig into public policy issues. While number 5 will cover EDC challenges. Webinar 6 will cover risks and technology issues. The remaining issues that we couldn't put into a single category will be covered in webinar and fact sheet number 7. And finally, we'll close the program out with moving forward with town center microgrids and what type of issues need to be resolved. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you on the upcoming webinars.